Welcome to Woo English, where we make learning English exciting through captivating stories from history. In today's lesson, we'll explore the life and legacy of Christopher Columbus, the daring explorer who forever changed the course of history. You'll learn how Columbus went from a young dreamer in Genoa to the man who opened the door to the Americas, a discovery that sparked the age of exploration and reshaped our world. We'll dive into his epic voyages across the Atlantic, the challenges he faced, and the impact his journeys had on both the Old World and the New. Our mission is to help you improve your English while immersing you in these incredible historical adventures. If you enjoy the lesson, don't forget to share it with your friends. Your comments and likes mean a lot to us, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Ready to embark on this journey? Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Dream of a Young Sailor. In the bustling, narrow streets of Genoa, a small town in Italy, a young boy named Christopher Columbus stood by the docks. His bright eyes sparkled with curiosity as he watched the ships. Grand, powerful vessels with billowing sails glide across the water. The sea, it called to him, whispering tales of adventure and lands beyond the horizon. Each wave that lapped against the shore seemed to carry a secret, a promise of something extraordinary just waiting to be discovered. Columbus was no ordinary boy. From a very young age, he was different. While other children played in the streets, laughing and chasing each other, Columbus was often found by the water's edge, lost in thought. His mind was filled with dreams of exploration, of venturing into the unknown, of finding new lands where no man had set foot before. The world, he believed, was much larger than anyone could imagine. His fascination with the sea was more than just a passing interest. It was a calling, a deep, irresistible pull that he could not ignore. Columbus was convinced that the earth was round, just like a ball, and if it was round, then surely by sailing west one could reach the east, those rich, mysterious lands of Asia that were spoken of in hushed tones, filled with gold, spices, and wonders beyond belief. But how could a poor boy from Genoa make such a dream come true? Columbus was not born into wealth or privilege. His family was humble, and life in Genoa was not easy. Yet the dream persisted, burning like a flame in his heart, guiding him forward. As he grew older, Columbus knew that if he wanted to make his dreams a reality, he needed to learn. And learn he did. He studied maps and charts, read ancient texts, and spoke to experienced sailors who had traveled the seas. He absorbed every piece of knowledge he could find, every story that hinted at lands beyond the known world. But knowledge alone was not enough. Columbus needed something more. He needed ships, sailors, and, most importantly, the support of a powerful ruler who believed in his vision. And so, with his dream in his heart and the knowledge he had gathered, Columbus set out on a journey, not across the ocean but across Europe, seeking someone who would believe in him. His journey was long and filled with disappointment. He traveled to Portugal, where the king listened to his plans, but in the end they said no. Columbus was not discouraged. His dream was too strong. He tried Italy next, but again the answer was the same. Rejection followed him wherever he went. Yet he never gave up. The sea still called to him, and he knew that somewhere someone would help him turn his dream into reality. And then he arrived in Spain. It was here, in this powerful kingdom ruled by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, that Columbus's fortunes began to change. He presented his plan to the Queen and the King, a bold, daring idea to sail west across the Atlantic to find a new route to Asia. They listened carefully. But even here, Columbus faced challenges. The court was divided. Some thought his plan was too risky, too uncertain. But Columbus persisted. He spoke with passion, with conviction, and his determination began to win them over. For years, Columbus waited and hoped. He faced many setbacks and delays, but he never lost faith. He knew that his dream was worth fighting for. And finally, in 1492, his patience paid off. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand agreed to support his voyage. They would provide the ships, the sailors, and the resources he needed to embark on his great adventure. Columbus was overjoyed. His dream was about to come true. The boy from Genoa, who had once stood by the docks dreaming of the sea, was now preparing to lead one of the most important voyages in history. The journey ahead was full of unknowns, but Columbus was ready. He believed in his dream, and he believed in the possibility of discovering new worlds. The preparations were made quickly. Columbus was given command of 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. These ships would carry him and his crew across the vast, uncharted ocean. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, they set sail from the port of Palos in Spain. The sea was calm, and the sky was clear. But the journey ahead was anything but certain. As the ships sailed farther and farther from the shores of Spain, the excitement began to mix with anxiety. The ocean seemed endless, stretching out in all directions with no land in sight. The sailors started to worry. They had never been so far from home before, and the fear of the unknown began to creep into their hearts. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of land. Some began to doubt, but not Columbus. Every day he stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew that they would find land. He could feel it in his bones. The sea, which had once been his dream, was now his reality, and he was determined to see it through no matter what. He encouraged his men, reminding them of the riches and wonders that awaited them. He assured them that they were close, so very close. But as the days passed, the tension on the ships grew. The sailors murmured among themselves, questioning whether they would ever see land again. Some even talked of turning back. But Columbus was resolute. He would not give up. Not now. Not after coming so far. And then, on the night of October 11th, 1492, something happened. A faint light was spotted in the distance. Could it be land? The excitement was palpable. The sailors crowded the deck, straining their eyes, hoping, praying, and as the first light of dawn broke on the horizon, there it was. Land! A cry rang out from the Pinta. Land! Land! The sailors erupted in cheers, their fears forgotten in an instant. Columbus had done it. He had found land. The island they had discovered was beautiful. Lush green trees, clear blue waters, and white sandy beaches. The people who lived there, the Taino, welcomed Columbus and his men with open arms. Columbus was sure he had found the islands off the coast of Asia. But in truth, he had discovered a new world, the Americas. The dream that had started in the heart of a young boy in Genoa had now changed the course of history forever. Columbus returned to Spain a hero, his name celebrated across the land. But his story was far from over. The discoveries he made would have consequences, both great and terrible. The world would never be the same again. And it all began with the dream of a young sailor who believed in the impossible. Chapter 2. The Journey Begins. Christopher Columbus, a name that would one day be known across the world. But before the fame, before the glory, Columbus was just a man with a dream that began in his childhood and grew stronger with every passing year. As he grew older, Columbus's fascination with the sea only deepened. He became a skilled sailor, navigating the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean Sea, learning the secrets of the winds and the tides. But no matter where he traveled, his mind was always on one thought. What lies across the Atlantic Ocean? The Atlantic, a vast, mysterious expanse of water that stretched endlessly to the west. Many believed that nothing lay beyond it, that it was an ocean with no end. But Columbus was different. He was convinced that by sailing west, he could find a new route to the rich lands of Asia. The stories of golden cities, exotic spices, and unimaginable wealth fueled his determination. But Columbus knew he could not do it alone. He needed help, ships, sailors, and most importantly, money to make his dream a reality. And so began the next chapter of Columbus's life, the chapter of endless seeking. He traveled from country to country, presenting his bold plan to kings and queens, nobles and merchants. First, he went to Portugal, a nation of sailors and explorers. Surely they would understand his vision. But the Portuguese king was not convinced. He listened to Columbus's plan, considered it, and then he said no. The king believed that the risks were too great, that Columbus was asking for too much, that his idea was impossible. But Columbus was not discouraged. His dream was too strong, too real to be crushed by a single rejection. He packed his bags and set off for Italy, his homeland. Surely the Italian merchants, known for their adventurous spirit, would see the potential in his plan. But once again, Columbus was met with disappointment. The Italian cities were too focused on their own affairs, too cautious to invest in such a risky venture. Time after time, Columbus faced rejection. Doors closed in his face, and his dream seemed to be slipping further and further away. But Columbus was a man of perseverance. He believed in his dream with every fiber of his being, and he would not give up. He would not let the world tell him that his dream was impossible. Finally, Columbus arrived in Spain, a land of great ambition, ruled by the powerful monarchs, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Spain was eager to expand its influence, to find new routes to the riches of the East. Perhaps this was the place where Columbus's dream would be realized. Columbus presented his plan to the Spanish court. He spoke with passion, with fire in his voice, painting a picture of a world where Spain would be the first to reach the fabled lands of Asia by sailing west. He described the riches that awaited them, the glory that would come to those who dared to believe in the impossible. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand listened carefully. They were intrigued, but they were also cautious. The risks were great, the journey was dangerous, and no one had ever attempted such a voyage before. And so Columbus waited. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. During this time, Columbus continued to hope, continued to believe, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. He remained in Spain, patiently waiting for an answer, for that one moment when his dream would finally be within reach. The Spanish court was divided. Some believed in Columbus's vision, while others dismissed him as a fool, a dreamer chasing after fantasies. But Columbus, he never wavered. He knew that his plan was not just a dream, it was a vision of the future. And finally, after years of waiting and hoping, the moment arrived. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. They said yes. The agreement was made. Columbus would be given the ships, the men, and the resources he needed to embark on his historic voyage. In return, he would bring back the riches of Asia, and Spain would be the first nation to claim these new lands. The excitement was overwhelming. Columbus, the man who had faced so much rejection, who had been told over and over again that his dream was impossible, was now on the brink of making history. Preparations began at once. Columbus was given command of 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. These ships were not grand or luxurious. They were simple, sturdy vessels, designed for exploration and adventure. Columbus handpicked his crew, men who shared his passion for the unknown, men who were willing to risk everything for the chance to discover new worlds. As the day of departure drew closer, the excitement grew. People gathered in the streets to watch the ships being prepared, to catch a glimpse of the man who would soon sail into the unknown. Columbus himself was filled with a mix of emotions, excitement, fear, anticipation. He knew the risks. He knew that the ocean was vast and dangerous, that they might never return. But he also knew that this was his destiny, the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. And so, on the morning of August 3rd, 1492, Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, looking out at the sea that had called to him since he was a boy. The sky was clear, the wind was strong, and the ships were ready to sail. With a final look at the land behind him, Columbus gave the order, and the ships began to move. The journey had begun. The ocean was vast, endless, and unknown. For weeks they sailed, the horizon always just out of reach, the promise of land always just a little further. The days were long, the nights even longer. The men grew restless, anxious. Some began to doubt, to fear that they would never find land, that they would be lost at sea forever. But Columbus never wavered. He stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart filled with hope. And then, on the night of October 11th, 1492, a cry rang out from the Pinta. "Land! Land!" The men rushed to the deck, their hearts pounding with excitement. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of an island. Columbus had done it. He had found land. The joy, the relief, the excitement, it was overwhelming. The dream that had driven him for so long had finally come true. The next morning, as the first light of dawn illuminated the island, Columbus stepped ashore. The land was beautiful, lush and green, with clear blue waters and white sandy beaches. The native people, the Taino, welcomed them with open arms, curious about these strangers from across the sea. Columbus believed he had found the islands off the coast of Asia, but in truth he had discovered something far greater, a new world. The journey that began with a dream had now changed the course of history forever. Columbus's discovery would open the door to the Americas, leading to an age of exploration, conquest, and colonization that would shape the world in ways no one could have imagined. The impact of his voyage would be felt for centuries, as the Old World and the New World collided, bringing with them both great opportunities and great challenges. Chapter 3. Setting Sail. The sun had just begun to rise on that fateful morning. August 3rd, 1492. The air was thick with anticipation. The small port town of Palos, usually so quiet and peaceful, was now alive with excitement. 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, stood proudly in the harbour, their sails catching the first light of dawn. The ships creaked and swayed gently with the movement of the water, as if they too were eager to begin the journey. Christopher Columbus, dressed in his finest captain's attire, stood on the deck of the Santa Maria. His heart was pounding with a mix of excitement and determination. This was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. Years of planning, dreaming, and convincing had led to this very day. He was finally setting out on the voyage that could change the world forever. The sky was clear, a brilliant blue that stretched out as far as the eye could see. The sea, calm and inviting, seemed to welcome the ships as they prepared to embark on their historic journey. The people of Palos had gathered at the docks to bid farewell to the sailors. Some cheered, some wept, and others simply watched in awe as the ships prepared to sail into the unknown. Columbus took a deep breath, and then, with a voice filled with resolve, he gave the order, "Raise the anchors! Set the sails!" The sailors, who had been anxiously waiting, sprang into action. The massive sails were unfurled, catching the wind and billowing out majestically. Slowly, the ships began to move, gliding gracefully out of the harbour and into the open sea. As the land began to fade behind them, the realization of what lay ahead began to sink in. They were leaving everything they knew, their homes, their families, their country, and sailing into an ocean that seemed endless, mysterious, and dangerous. For many of the sailors, this was the farthest they had ever been from home. The excitement of the departure soon gave way to a deep, gnawing fear. Days turned into weeks, and still there was nothing but water all around them. The vast, empty ocean stretched out in every direction, with no land in sight. The endless blue of the sea and sky began to play tricks on their minds. The horizon, which had seemed so promising, now felt like a prison. The sailors began to whisper among themselves, doubts creeping into their hearts. What if they never found land? What if they had sailed too far? What if they were lost? The unknown was terrifying, and the men grew restless and anxious. Some began to mutter about turning back, about abandoning the voyage before it was too late. But Columbus never lost hope. He stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unwavering in his belief that they would find what they were looking for. He knew that the journey was dangerous, that the ocean was vast and unforgiving, but he also knew that the greatest discoveries were never easy. He reminded his men of the promise that lay ahead: riches, glory, and a place in history as the first to discover a new route to Asia. The days were long and hot, the sun beating down on them mercilessly. The nights were cold and lonely, the stars shining brightly in the sky, reminding them of just how small they were in the grand scheme of the universe. But through it all, Columbus remained steadfast. He was driven by a force stronger than fear, a force that kept him going, even when the odds seemed impossible. Then one day the sea began to change. The water, which had been so calm and serene, grew choppy and wild. The wind picked up, howling through the sails, and dark clouds gathered on the horizon. A storm was coming, and it was coming fast. The sailors scrambled to secure the ships, their hearts pounding with fear. The sky turned dark, and the waves rose higher and higher, crashing against the ships with a force that shook them to their very core. The ships were tossed about like toys in the hands of a giant, the wind tearing at the sails, the rain lashing at their faces. The men clung to whatever they could, praying for the storm to pass. But Columbus stood firm. Even in the midst of the chaos, he was calm. He had faced storms before. He knew the sea, and he knew that they had to ride it out. The storm raged on through the night, but eventually the winds began to die down, the waves grew smaller, and the sky began to clear. When the sun finally rose the next morning, the sea was calm once again. The sailors, exhausted and shaken, looked around at each other, their faces filled with relief. They had survived. But more importantly, they had seen the strength of their captain. Columbus had guided them through the storm, and their respect for him grew even stronger. The journey continued. Days passed, then weeks. The ocean seemed endless, and the strain of the voyage weighed heavily on everyone. Food and water began to run low, and the men grew weak. The fear of never finding land returned, stronger than ever before. Some of the sailors began to lose hope, their spirits broken by the relentless ocean. But Columbus remained as determined as ever. He gathered his men, spoke to them with a voice full of conviction, and reminded them of the dream that had brought them all together. He spoke of the new lands that awaited them, of the riches they would find, of the history they would make. He urged them to keep their faith, to trust in the journey, and to trust in him. And then, on the night of October 11th, 1492, something incredible happened. The Pinta, sailing ahead of the other ships, signaled that land had been spotted. The cry of "Land, land!" echoed across the water, and the sailors rushed to the deck, straining their eyes to see through the darkness. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of an island. The excitement was overwhelming. The men cheered, their fears and doubts forgotten in an instant. Columbus had done it. They had found land. The dream that had seemed so impossible, so far away, was now a reality. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, the ships approached the island. It was a beautiful sight. Lush green trees, clear blue waters, and white sandy beaches. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the promise of adventure and discovery. Columbus stepped ashore, his heart swelling with pride and relief. He had led his men across the unknown ocean, through storms and fears, and had found a new world. The moment was historic. It was the beginning of a new era, one that would change the course of history forever. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but Columbus had never given up. His dream had carried him across the ocean to a land that no one had ever seen before. And as he stood on that island, looking out at the vast ocean that had brought him there, he knew that this was only the beginning. The world was about to change, and Christopher Columbus had set it in motion. Chapter 4. Land Ahoy. The long, grueling days at sea seemed endless. The vast Atlantic stretched out in every direction, an ocean of blue that had swallowed the hopes and dreams of so many before. The sailors, their faces weathered by the sun and the salty wind, were growing desperate. 2 months had passed since they had left Spain, and still there was no land in sight. Every day was the same sky, the same sea, the same endless horizon. Doubt began to creep into their hearts, gnawing at their courage like a relentless tide. But Columbus never wavered. He stood at the helm of the Santa Maria, his eyes scanning the horizon with a determination that never faltered. He knew that they were close. He could feel it. The signs were there, flocks of birds flying overhead, the drifting branches and leaves that hinted at land nearby. Yet, as the days passed without any sight of land, even Columbus began to feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. And then, on the night of October 11th, 1492, something miraculous happened. A faint light flickered in the distance, a small, barely noticeable glow on the horizon. Columbus strained his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. Could it be? He held his breath, waiting, watching, but the light vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Was it a trick of the mind, a false hope? The sailors were restless, tired, and fearful, but Columbus urged them to press on. They had come too far to turn back now. The night was long, filled with anticipation and anxiety. The darkness seemed to stretch forever, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to break, a cry rang out from the Pinta. "Land! Land!" The sound echoed across the water, and in an instant, everything changed. The sailors rushed to the deck, their hearts racing with excitement. There, on the horizon, was the unmistakable silhouette of land. A small island, rising up from the sea like a promise, a beacon of hope after so many weeks of uncertainty. The men cheered, their voices filled with joy and relief. Tears streamed down their faces as they embraced each other, their fears forgotten in the face of this incredible discovery. Columbus had done it. He had found land. The dream that had driven him for so long, that had seemed so impossible, was now a reality. He stood on the deck, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment that would change the course of history forever. As the ships drew closer to the island, the full beauty of the land revealed itself. The island was lush and green, covered in dense forests that seemed to glow in the morning light. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of flowers and fresh earth. The water was crystal clear, sparkling like 1,000 diamonds in the sunlight. It was a paradise, a new world waiting to be explored. Columbus ordered the ships to anchor, and the small boats were lowered into the water. He and his men climbed into the boats, their hands trembling with excitement as they rowed toward the shore. The closer they got, the more their senses were overwhelmed by the sights and sounds of this new land. Birds with bright, colourful feathers flew overhead, their songs filling the air with a melody unlike anything the men had ever heard before. When they finally reached the shore, Columbus was the first to step onto the sand. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed with emotion, and kissed the ground. Tears of joy streamed down his face as he looked around at the land that he had so longed to find. The other men followed, some weeping, some laughing, all of them feeling the same sense of awe and wonder. They had made it. They had discovered a new world. The people who lived on the island, the Taino, watched from a distance as the strangers from across the sea arrived on their shores. They were curious, but also cautious. They had never seen men like these before, with their strange clothes, their shining armor, and their powerful ships. But the Taino were a peaceful people, and they approached Columbus and his men with open arms, offering them gifts of fruit and bread. Columbus was fascinated by the Taino, their simple way of life, their kindness, their connection to the land. It was all so different from the world he had known. He believed he had found the islands off the coast of Asia, the Indies, and he called the people Indians. He marveled at the beauty of the land and the generosity of its people, convinced that he had found the gateway to the riches of the East. But in truth, Columbus had discovered something far greater. This was not Asia. This was a new world, a world that no European had ever seen before. The island Columbus had landed on was part of the Bahamas in the Caribbean Sea. And though he did not know it at the time, his discovery would change the world in ways that no one could have imagined. The days that followed were filled with exploration and discovery. Columbus and his men sailed from island to island, marveling at the beauty of the land and the richness of its resources. Everywhere they went, they were welcomed by the Taino, who shared their food, their knowledge, and their friendship. Columbus took careful notes, mapping the islands and documenting everything he saw. He collected samples of the plants, the fruits, and even the gold ornaments that some of the Taino wore. But even as Columbus marveled at the wonders of this new world, he also began to think of the opportunities it presented. He thought of the wealth that could be brought back to Spain, the glory that awaited him upon his return. He thought of the lands that could be claimed in the name of the Spanish crown and the power that could be gained from controlling these new territories. Columbus was a man of his time, driven by the same desires for wealth and power that fueled the age of exploration. And so, with a heart full of dreams and ambitions, Columbus prepared to return to Spain. He had achieved what many thought was impossible. He had crossed the Atlantic and discovered a new world. But the journey was far from over. This was only the beginning of a story that would unfold over the years to come. A story of exploration, conquest, and change that would reshape the world forever. As Columbus set sail for home, he looked back at the islands, the new world he had discovered. He felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment, but also a sense of responsibility. He knew that his discovery would bring great change, both for the people of Europe and for the people of the lands he had found. The impact of Columbus's voyages would be profound, leading to the exchange of cultures, ideas, and goods between the old world and the new. But it would also bring conflict, conquest, and suffering to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The dream of discovery that had driven Columbus across the ocean would have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. Consequences that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. Remember, you're listening to Woo English, where we make learning English both fun and educational with stories that matter. If you're enjoying the journey through the life and legacy of Christopher Columbus, don't forget to share it with your friends. Your comments and likes mean a lot to us. Your feedback helps us create even more engaging content. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this one. Now let's dive into Chapter 5. Chapter 5. The Return to Spain. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the promise of adventure as Columbus and his men continued their exploration of the islands. The months had flown by in a blur of discovery. Each new island they encountered held secrets, treasures, and mysteries. Gold glinted in the sunlight, spices filled the air with their rich aromas, and strange, exotic fruits delighted their senses. Columbus's heart swelled with pride. He was certain now certain that he had found a new route to Asia, to the lands of unimaginable wealth. Everywhere they went, the Taino people greeted them with warmth and curiosity. They offered gifts, shared their food, and welcomed the strangers from across the sea with open arms. Columbus, convinced that he was in the Indies, referred to these gentle people as Indians. He marveled at their simplicity, their generosity, and he noted everything. His journals filled with descriptions of the land, the people, and the treasures he had found. This was the proof he needed. Proof that his journey had not been in vain. Proof that he had indeed found a new world, rich with possibilities. But Columbus knew that he could not stay forever. He had to return to Spain, to share his discoveries with the king and queen, to show them the riches he had found, to claim the glory that was now within his grasp. The thought of returning home filled him with both excitement and anxiety. He had been gone for months. What would he find when he returned? Would they believe his tales of golden islands and new peoples? Would they see him as the hero he believed himself to be? The decision was made. It was time to set sail for Spain. The ships were loaded with the treasures they had gathered: gold, spices, exotic birds, and even a few of the Taino people who had agreed to accompany Columbus back to Europe. The men were ready to go home, their hearts filled with the anticipation of what awaited them. But the journey back would not be easy. The sea, which had been so calm and welcoming on their outward voyage, now turned against them. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind began to howl through the sails. The ocean, once a gentle pathway, now became a churning, angry beast. The ships were tossed about on the waves, the men clinging desperately to the ropes, praying for their lives. Storm after storm battered them, each one more fierce than the last. The waves crashed over the decks, threatening to pull them under. The men grew weak from hunger and exhaustion. The food and water they had brought with them began to run out. Despair set in as the days turned into weeks, and still there was no sight of land. But Columbus would not give up. He was determined to return to Spain, to fulfill his destiny. He rallied his men, urging them to hold on just a little longer, to have faith that they would make it through. His voice, strong and filled with conviction, was a beacon of hope in the midst of the storm. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the storms began to die down. The clouds parted, and the sun broke through, casting its warm golden light on the weary sailors. Land, land at last. The men wept with relief as they saw the coastline of Spain appear on the horizon. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. As the ships sailed into the harbour, the people of Spain gathered to see the return of Columbus and his men. Word had spread of their journey, of the new lands they had discovered, of the riches they had brought back. The docks were filled with cheering crowds, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had done the impossible, the man who had crossed the ocean and returned with tales of a new world. When Columbus stepped ashore, he was greeted like a hero. The people cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of admiration and awe. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand awaited him, their eyes alight with curiosity and pride. Columbus knelt before them, offering the treasures he had brought back, the gold, the spices, the exotic animals, and the Taino people who had travelled with him. The Queen and King were pleased, more than pleased. They were overjoyed. Columbus had delivered on his promise. He had brought them a new world. But even as the celebrations began, even as Columbus was showered with honours and praise, there was a restlessness in his heart. He had achieved so much, but it wasn't enough. The islands he had found were only the beginning. There was more out there, more to discover, more to explore, more to claim in the name of Spain. Columbus could not ignore the call of the sea, the pull of the unknown. It was a force that drove him, that filled him with a burning desire to return. He longed to go back, to continue his journey, to uncover the secrets that still lay hidden in the vast, uncharted waters. He spoke of his plans to the Queen and King, of the need to return to the New World, to explore further, to find even greater riches. He promised them that what he had found was just the beginning, that there was so much more to discover. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand listened carefully. They saw the fire in Columbus's eyes, the passion that had driven him across the ocean and back. They knew that this was a man who would not rest until he had fulfilled his destiny, and so they agreed. They would support him once more. Columbus would return to the New World. He would continue his voyage of discovery, his quest for glory. The preparations began almost immediately. Columbus was given more ships, more men, and more resources. This time, his fleet would be larger, more powerful, better equipped to handle the challenges that lay ahead. The excitement was palpable. Columbus could hardly wait to set sail again, to return to the islands that had captured his imagination, to venture even further into the unknown. But as he prepared for his second voyage, Columbus knew that the stakes were higher than ever before. He was no longer just a man with a dream. He was a man with a mission that would shape the future of the world. The new world he had discovered was not just a place of wonder and beauty. It was a place of opportunity, a place where the ambitions of Europe would collide with the lives of the indigenous peoples who called it home. Columbus's return to Spain had marked the beginning of a new era, an era of exploration, conquest, and colonization. The impact of his voyages would be felt for centuries, as the Old World and the New World became inextricably linked. The treasures he had brought back were only the beginning of a story that would change the course of history forever. And so, with his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart filled with dreams of what lay beyond, Columbus prepared to set sail once more. The New World was calling him, and he was ready to answer. Chapter 6. More Voyages. The Ocean. It had called to him once, and it called to him still. Christopher Columbus, now a man of great renown, could not ignore its voice. The first voyage had been triumphant. He had returned to Spain a hero, celebrated for discovering what he believed were the islands off the coast of Asia. But deep inside, Columbus knew that his work was not finished. There was so much more to explore, so much more to discover. The thrill of the unknown pulled at him, beckoning him back to the sea. And so, with the support of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, Columbus embarked on his second voyage. This time his fleet was larger, with 17 ships and over 1,000 men, soldiers, sailors, and settlers, all eager to claim a piece of the new world. They set sail from Spain with high hopes, dreams of gold and glory filling their hearts. But the journey ahead was filled with challenges they could not have imagined. The sea, once a familiar companion, became a place of danger and uncertainty. Storms raged across the Atlantic, tossing the ships like leaves in the wind. Days turned into weeks as they battled the elements, the men growing weary and fearful. But Columbus remained resolute. He was driven by a vision, a belief that he was on the brink of something extraordinary. He could not, would not, turn back. When they finally reached the islands of the Caribbean, the men were overjoyed. The lush landscapes, the clear blue waters, the rich, fertile lands. It was everything they had hoped for. But Columbus, ever the explorer, did not stop to rest. He pressed on, leading his men deeper into the unknown, always searching for more land, more treasures, more proof that he had indeed found a new route to Asia. But this time the welcome was not as warm. The native peoples, who had greeted Columbus with open arms on his first voyage, were wary. Some were even hostile. Conflicts broke out as the Spanish settlers began to impose their will on the land and its inhabitants. Columbus, who had once seen himself as a friend and protector of the Taino people, now found himself caught in a web of violence and misunderstanding. The settlers, driven by greed and hunger for gold, clashed with the Taino. They took land, demanded tribute, and enslaved the people. Columbus tried to maintain control, but the situation spiraled out of his hands. The dream of a peaceful coexistence with the native peoples was slipping away. The new world, which had once seemed so full of promise, was becoming a place of conflict and sorrow. And yet, despite these difficulties, Columbus did not give up. He continued to explore, pushing further into the Caribbean, discovering new islands and lands. He believed with all his heart that he was on the edge of a great discovery, that just beyond the horizon lay the riches of Asia. He mapped the coasts of Cuba and Jamaica, and he sailed along the coast of Central America, always hoping to find the passage to the east. But the challenges were mounting. The settlers grew restless, angry at the lack of gold and the harsh conditions they faced. They began to question Columbus's leadership, to doubt his judgment. Mutiny brewed beneath the surface, and Columbus, who had once been a celebrated hero, found himself increasingly isolated. On his third voyage, Columbus faced his greatest challenge yet. He sailed further south, reaching the coast of South America. As he explored the Orinoco River in present-day Venezuela, he was struck by the realization that this was no mere island chain. This was a continent, a landmass so vast it could only be part of the unknown southern lands described in ancient texts. But even as he marveled at this new discovery, Columbus was tormented by the growing unrest among his men. The conditions in the new settlements were dire. The settlers were unhappy, plagued by disease, hunger, and conflict with the native peoples. The dream of a new world was turning into a nightmare. Columbus, desperate to maintain order, was forced to take harsh measures. He imposed strict rules, punished those who disobeyed, and tried to keep the fragile colony together. But his efforts only fueled the discontent. The settlers accused him of tyranny, of being out of touch with the realities they faced. Word of the troubles in the New World reached Spain, and the once great Columbus was summoned back to answer for the chaos. He was arrested, put in chains, and sent back to Spain in disgrace. The man who had once been hailed as the discoverer of a new world was now a prisoner, his reputation in tatters. The dream had turned bitter, and Columbus found himself wondering if it had all been worth it. But even in his darkest hour, Columbus's spirit was not broken. He still believed in his mission, in the importance of what he had done. He pleaded his case before the Spanish court, insisting that he had been misunderstood, that his discoveries were too great to be overshadowed by the troubles in the colonies. Queen Isabella, who had once been his greatest supporter, showed mercy. Columbus was released, his titles restored. But the glory of his early years was gone. Undeterred, Columbus embarked on his fourth and final voyage. This time, his mission was clear: to find the passage to Asia, to prove that his vision had been right all along. He sailed along the coast of Central America, battling storms, shipwrecks, and hostile encounters with native peoples. The journey was long and difficult, and the hardships were greater than anything he had faced before. His ships were damaged, his men were sick and tired, and the conditions were unbearable. Stranded on the coast of Jamaica, Columbus and his men were left to survive on the charity of the local people, who provided them with food and shelter. Months passed, and the hope of rescue faded. But Columbus held on. He never lost faith in his mission, in the dream that had driven him across the ocean 4 times. Finally, after nearly a year, rescue came. Columbus returned to Spain, a shadow of his former self, his body weak, his spirit tired. The world had changed since his first voyage, and so had he. The dream that had once filled him with fire now felt distant, elusive. The lands he had discovered were not Asia. They were something else entirely, something he could not fully understand. Columbus spent his final years in relative obscurity, writing letters, pleading for recognition, trying to secure his legacy. He died in 1506, still believing that he had found a new route to Asia, never knowing that he had instead opened the door to the Americas, a new world that would forever change the course of history. His voyages, filled with triumph and tragedy, discovery and loss, marked the beginning of an era of exploration, of conquest, of connection between continents. The world was larger, richer, and more complex than anyone had imagined, and Columbus, driven by his relentless pursuit of the unknown, had played a pivotal role in revealing it. Chapter 7. The Challenges of Leadership. The thrill of discovery, the joy of stepping onto unknown shores. For Columbus, these moments were the rewards of his voyages, but beyond the excitement of exploration lay the heavier burden of leadership, a responsibility far greater than simply guiding ships across the ocean. Being an explorer was not easy, but being a leader was even harder. As the admiral of the ocean sea, Columbus had to make decisions that would affect not only his crew, but also the future of the lands they had found. And these decisions were never simple. The sea might have been unpredictable, but human nature, oh, that was a storm of its own. Columbus's men were a diverse group, sailors, soldiers, and settlers, all with different backgrounds, hopes, and fears. Some were drawn by the promise of riches, others by the thrill of adventure, and a few were simply looking for a new start. But as the weeks turned into months, the hardships of life in the new world began to wear on them. The reality of what they had embarked upon was far different from the dream they had imagined. The heat, the hunger, the unknown dangers that lurked in the jungles and the forests. These challenges tested the men's resolve every day. Supplies ran low, and disease spread through the camps. The gold they had hoped to find in abundance was scarce, and the food they needed was hard to come by. The men grew restless, and with restlessness came doubt. At first, Columbus tried to inspire them with his vision of the wealth that awaited them, of the glory they would bring to Spain. But as time passed, even his words began to lose their power. Arguments broke out. Men questioned his authority, his decisions. Some whispered that they should return to Spain, that the admiral was leading them into disaster. Columbus faced these challenges with a mixture of determination and frustration. He had led them across the ocean. He had discovered new lands. But now, instead of unity, there was division. Instead of loyalty, there was rebellion. In the face of this unrest, Columbus had to make difficult choices. He imposed strict rules, demanding obedience and discipline. Those who defied him were punished. It was a harsh approach, but Columbus believed it was necessary to maintain order in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. He could not allow his men to lose hope, to give in to their fears. They were on the brink of something monumental, and they had to see it through. But the challenges were not just from within. The relationship between Columbus's men and the native peoples, the Taino, who had first welcomed them with such warmth, was growing increasingly strained. The initial curiosity and friendship had begun to turn into mistrust and conflict. The settlers, driven by greed and desperation, demanded more and more from the Taino, more food, more gold, more labor. The Taino, who had lived in harmony with their land for generations, found themselves under pressure from these strangers who did not understand their ways. Columbus, who had once hoped for peaceful coexistence, now found himself in the middle of a growing tension. He tried to mediate, to find a balance between the needs of his men and the rights of the Taino. But it was a delicate line to walk. The settlers wanted more than the land could give, and the Taino were being pushed to the brink. Skirmishes broke out, and the peace that Columbus had worked so hard to maintain began to crumble. The dream of finding great wealth and easy living, it was turning into a nightmare. The settlements that Columbus had hoped would flourish were struggling to survive. The challenges of the New World were far greater than anyone had anticipated. The land was beautiful, yes, but it was also harsh and unforgiving. The promise of riches had blinded them to the reality of what it took to build a life in this new land. Columbus felt the weight of these failures deeply. He had set out to find a new route to Asia, to bring wealth and glory to Spain. But instead, he was faced with the difficulties of governing a land he barely understood, of leading men who no longer trusted him. He had to confront the reality that leadership was not just about discovery and adventure. It was about making hard decisions in the face of adversity, about holding on to hope when everything seemed to be falling apart. The rebellion of the settlers was the most difficult challenge of all. In their eyes, Columbus had failed them. He had promised them gold, but all they had found was hardship. Some of them decided they had had enough. They would no longer follow the admiral. They plotted against him, planning to take control of the colony and return to Spain without him. When Columbus learned of the rebellion, he was heartbroken, but also resolute. He could not let this happen. He acted swiftly, capturing the leaders of the mutiny and punishing them severely. It was a harsh reminder to the rest that he was still in command, that he would not tolerate defiance. But the cost of maintaining control was high. The trust between Columbus and his men had been shattered, and the spirit of the expedition was broken. Despite these challenges, Columbus did not give up. He continued to search for new lands, for new opportunities to fulfill the promises he had made. He explored further, discovering more islands, more territories that he claimed for Spain, but the discoveries were overshadowed by the growing unrest in the colonies. The dream that had driven Columbus across the ocean was slipping away. The glory he had imagined was fading, replaced by the harsh reality of leadership in a land that seemed determined to resist him. The settlers, who had once looked to him for guidance, now saw him as the source of their suffering. And Columbus, who had once been so sure of his vision, now found himself questioning everything. Was this what he had set out to achieve? Had the dream of exploration led them into ruin? The New World was not the paradise he had imagined. It was a land of challenges, of conflict, of loss. But even as these doubts crept into his heart, Columbus held on to the hope that somewhere, somehow, he would find what he was looking for. That the New World, with all its difficulties, still held the promise of something greater. He had faced storms at sea, and now he was facing storms on land. But he was an explorer, and explorers did not give up, no matter how hard the journey became. Chapter 8. The Fall from Grace. The Winds of Fortune. How quickly they can change. Christopher Columbus, once the celebrated hero who had dared to sail into the unknown, now found himself caught in a storm, not on the sea, but in the world he had helped to discover. The thrill of his earlier successes had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of governing a land far from home, and by the growing discontent of both the settlers and the Spanish crown. Columbus had returned to Spain after his first voyage as a hero. The streets had been filled with cheers, and the royal court had showered him with honours. But as time passed, the glow of that triumph began to dim. The people in Spain, they had expected much more. Tales of endless gold, of vast riches flowing back to the kingdom, had filled their dreams. But the reality, it was much different. The new lands were not the easy treasure troves they had imagined. The settlers in the New World were struggling. The colonies were not thriving as Columbus had hoped. Instead, they were plagued by disease, hunger, and conflict. The promise of wealth had turned into a harsh struggle for survival. And as the situation worsened, so did the complaints that reached the ears of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Whispers, rumours, accusations, they began to spread. People spoke of Columbus as a tyrant, a man who ruled with an iron fist, who was too harsh, too demanding. They said he was out of touch with the needs of his people, that his leadership was failing. The settlers, once full of hope, now looked at him with suspicion and resentment. And in Spain, the admiration for Columbus began to turn into doubt. Columbus, on his third voyage, was faced with even greater challenges. He discovered the mainland of South America, a new and vast land that filled him with awe, but the troubles in the colonies overshadowed this achievement. The settlers in Hispaniola had risen against him, tired of his rule, tired of the hardships they faced. The situation grew so dire that the Spanish crown sent an investigator, Francisco de Bobadilla, to take control. When Bobadilla arrived, he did not come as an ally, but as a judge. He listened to the complaints, he saw the unrest, and he decided that Columbus was no longer fit to govern. The great admiral, the man who had crossed the Atlantic and opened a new world to Europe, was arrested. Columbus, the hero, was now a prisoner, and he was placed in chains. Can you imagine? The humiliation, the pain, to be treated like a common criminal after all he had achieved. The chains, cold, heavy. They bit into his wrists as he was led onto the ship that would take him back to Spain. Columbus, who had once sailed the seas with pride, now sailed in disgrace. The journey back was long and filled with sorrow, each wave a reminder of the fall from the heights of glory. When Columbus arrived in Spain, he was a shadow of his former self. The cheers that had once greeted him were gone. Instead, there were whispers, curious eyes watching him as he was taken to court. He stood before King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the very rulers who had once placed their trust in him, who had sent him on his great voyages. Now they looked at him with doubt, with disappointment. But Columbus did not bow his head. He did not let the chains of doubt and fear break his spirit. He spoke with the same passion that had driven him across the ocean, the same conviction that had led him to believe in a new route to Asia. He told the king and queen of the lands he had discovered, of the vast potential that still lay hidden in the new world. He pleaded with them to see beyond the troubles, to recognize the greatness of his mission. And they listened. Queen Isabella, especially, still saw the fire in Columbus's eyes, the determination that had once inspired her to fund his voyage. She remembered the promise of the new world, the dream that had driven them all. She could not ignore the fact that Columbus had indeed found something extraordinary, even if it was not what they had originally sought. In the end, the king and queen showed mercy. They released Columbus from his chains, restored his titles, and allowed him to return to the new world one last time. But the trust, the glory, it was not the same. Columbus was a free man, but the shadow of his fall lingered. The doubts and accusations had left a mark that could not be erased. Columbus set sail again, but this time the journey was different. The excitement of discovery had been replaced by a sense of urgency, of something unfinished. He was older now, his body weakened by years of hardship, but his spirit was as strong as ever. He knew that the new world still held secrets, still had the potential to fulfill the dreams he had once envisioned. On his final voyage, Columbus faced even greater challenges. The seas were rougher, the storms more frequent, and the lands he found were not the golden cities he had hoped for. He explored the coast of Central America, convinced that he was close to finding the passage to Asia, the goal that had driven him from the very beginning. But the land was relentless, the journey grueling. His ships were battered, his crew exhausted, and hope was fading. Stranded on the shores of Jamaica, Columbus and his men were left to survive on the goodwill of the native people, waiting for rescue that seemed like it would never come. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and still they waited. Columbus, once the great explorer, now found himself at the mercy of forces beyond his control. But even in these dire circumstances, Columbus never lost faith. He still believed in his mission, in the significance of what he had done. He held on to the belief that history would recognize his achievements, that the world would one day understand the importance of his discoveries. And in that, he found strength. Finally, after nearly a year, rescue came. Columbus returned to Spain, his body frail, his spirit weary, but his heart still full of the dream that had driven him across the ocean so many times. He spent his final years in quiet obscurity, writing letters, reflecting on his voyages, and trying to secure his legacy. Christopher Columbus died on May 20th, 1506, still believing that he had found a new route to Asia, never knowing that he had instead revealed a new world, a world that would forever change the course of history. His fall from grace was a reminder that the journey of discovery is not just about triumphs, but also about the trials and tribulations that shape a legacy. The story of Columbus is one of ambition, courage, and the relentless pursuit of a dream. But it is also a story of the consequences that come with such greatness. Columbus had opened the door to the Americas, but in doing so, he had also set in motion events that would alter the world in ways no one could have foreseen. Chapter 9. The Final Voyage. The year was 1502. Columbus, now older and wearier than in his days of youthful adventure, stood on the deck of his ship, gazing out at the endless horizon. This would be his fourth and final voyage, a journey not just across the ocean, but into the depths of his own relentless dream. The dream of finding a direct route to Asia still burned within him, though the years had tempered it with the harsh realities of his previous expeditions. This time, Columbus was determined to find the passage to Asia that had eluded him for so long. His heart, though scarred by disappointment and failure, still clung to the hope that just beyond the next stretch of ocean, he would uncover the route that would finally vindicate his years of struggle. The fleet set sail with high hopes, but almost immediately the journey was beset by challenges. The Atlantic, which had been Columbus's companion for so many years, now seemed to turn against him. Violent storms battered the ships, tossing them like toys in the hands of an angry sea. The winds howled through the rigging, the waves crashed over the decks, and the men clung to their posts, praying for the storm to pass. Days turned into nights, and still the storms raged. The fleet was scattered, and Columbus, aboard his flagship, fought to keep his vessel from being torn apart by the fury of the ocean. But Columbus did not falter. He had faced storms before. He knew the power of the sea, and he knew how to survive. Yet, even as he battled the elements, there was a growing sense of foreboding, a feeling that this voyage was different, that the challenges ahead would test him in ways he had never imagined. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the storms began to subside. The battered fleet regrouped, and Columbus pressed on, ever determined to find the elusive passage to Asia. They reached the coast of Central America, a land of dense jungles, towering mountains, and rivers that wound their way through the heart of the continent like veins of gold. Columbus believed. He believed with all his heart that this was the gateway he had been searching for. The rivers seemed to beckon him inward, promising a path that would lead him to the riches of the East. He and his men explored the coast, their eyes wide with hope, their hearts full of expectation. But the further they went, the more elusive the passage became. The jungles were thick, impenetrable. The rivers twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the unknown, but never to the ocean on the other side. Days turned into weeks as they searched. But each new discovery only led to more questions, more uncertainty. The men grew tired, their spirits began to wane. They had been promised Asia, but all they found were more obstacles, more challenges. And then disaster struck. One of the ships was caught on a reef and wrecked. The crew barely escaped with their lives, and the loss of the ship was a heavy blow. But Columbus was undeterred. He rallied his men, urging them to continue the search, to press on despite the setbacks. But as they pushed further, they encountered something even more dangerous than the jungle: hostility. The native peoples of the region, wary of these strange visitors, began to resist their presence. Skirmishes broke out, and the once welcoming land became a place of fear and danger. Columbus tried to maintain peace, but the situation grew increasingly tense. His men were outnumbered, exhausted, and far from home, and the prospect of finding the passage to Asia seemed more distant than ever. The journey took its toll on Columbus. The years of hardship, the unrelenting pursuit of his dream, had worn him down. His body, once strong and full of energy, was now weakened by illness and age, but his spirit refused to break. Even as he faced the mounting challenges, even as his body failed him, Columbus's mind was still sharp, his determination unyielding. And then the final blow came. Stranded on the coast of Jamaica, Columbus and his men were cut off from the rest of the world. Their ships were damaged, their supplies dwindling, and the prospect of rescue seemed slim. They were alone, surrounded by a hostile land, with little hope of finding the passage that had driven them to these distant shores. For over a year, a long, grueling year, Columbus and his men waited on the island, their hopes fading with each passing day. They survived on the goodwill of the native people, who provided them with food and shelter, but the dream of finding the passage to Asia was slipping away, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. Columbus, now a shadow of the man who had once boldly crossed the Atlantic, spent his days in reflection. He thought of the journeys he had made, the discoveries he had brought to the world, and the price he had paid for his relentless pursuit of a dream. He knew deep down that the passage he had sought might never be found, but he also knew that his voyages had changed the world in ways he could not have imagined. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, rescue came. A ship arrived, sent by the Spanish crown, to bring Columbus and his men back to Spain. The journey home was long and arduous, but Columbus was at peace. He knew that he had given everything to his quest, that he had pushed the boundaries of the known world and opened the door to a new era of exploration and discovery. When Columbus returned to Spain, he was no longer the celebrated hero of his first voyage, but he was also not forgotten. The world he had helped to reveal was still coming to terms with the enormity of what he had discovered. The Americas, as they would come to be known, were not the lands of Asia that Columbus had sought, but something far greater, a new world rich with possibility that would forever change the course of history. Columbus spent the last years of his life in relative obscurity, but his legacy was undeniable. He had shown that the world was larger, more diverse, and more interconnected than anyone had imagined. His voyages had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the globe, linking continents, cultures, and peoples in ways that were both profound and far-reaching. As Columbus lay on his deathbed in 1506, he still believed. He still believed that he had found a new route to Asia, that his final voyage had brought him closer to the goal that had driven him for so many years. But history would remember him differently, not as the man who found Asia, but as the man who opened the door to the Americas, who, through his relentless pursuit of a dream, had changed the world forever. The final voyage had been one of challenges, of trials that tested the very core of his being, but it had also been a journey of discovery, of pushing the limits of human knowledge and endurance. And though Columbus's dream of finding a direct route to Asia was never realized, the world he revealed was far greater than anything he could have imagined. The legacy of Columbus is a complex one, filled with both triumph and tragedy, but it is a legacy that continues to echo through the centuries, reminding us of the power of exploration, the consequences of ambition, and the enduring impact of one man's vision. Chapter 9. The Final Voyage. The year was 1502. Christopher Columbus, now older and marked by the trials of time, prepared for what would be his final voyage across the vast Atlantic. This journey, this last chance to find the passage to Asia that had eluded him for so long, was not just another expedition. It was a mission, a desperate quest to fulfill the dream that had driven him for years. His hair, now streaked with grey, and his body, worn from countless battles with the sea, bore the signs of a man who had given everything to his cause. Yet his spirit, it remained unbroken. The ships, 4 of them this time, were readied, and Columbus set sail once more. As the familiar coast of Spain faded from view, he felt the weight of both hope and fear. This voyage, it had to succeed. The sea was calm at first, as if welcoming him back, but Columbus knew better than to trust its gentle embrace. The ocean was unpredictable, as wild and untamable as the lands he sought. Days turned into weeks, and the fleet pressed on, deeper into the unknown. The winds were with them, pushing the ships forward, but the journey was far from easy. The seas, which had seemed so friendly at the outset, soon turned treacherous. Storms, violent and unrelenting, battered the ships, tossing them like toys in the hands of an angry giant. The skies darkened, the waves rose high, and the winds screamed through the rigging. The men clung to their stations, their faces etched with fear, but Columbus stood firm. He had faced storms before, had survived the worst the sea could offer. This time would be no different, or so he hoped. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the storm subsided. The battered fleet limped forward, their destination still uncertain, but their determination unshaken. They reached the coast of Central America, a land of dense jungles and towering mountains, where Columbus believed he would find the passage to Asia. This land, it was mysterious, full of promise, and yet it resisted him. The rivers twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the continent, but never revealing the ocean on the other side. The men grew restless, tired of the endless search, of the dangers that lurked in every shadow. The jungles were thick, the heat oppressive, and the journey more grueling than they had imagined. But Columbus, driven by the dream that had consumed his life, pushed on. He believed, with every fibre of his being, that the passage was near, that just beyond the next bend he would find what he had sought for so long. But the land had other plans. As they pressed further, the challenges grew. The ships, already weakened by the storms, struggled to navigate the treacherous waters. One of the vessels struck a reef and was wrecked, its crew barely escaping with their lives. The loss was a heavy blow, but Columbus refused to give up. He rallied his men, urging them to continue the search, to keep faith in the mission. Yet, as they journeyed on, they encountered not only the dangers of the land, but also the hostility of its people. The native tribes, once curious and welcoming, grew wary of these strangers who demanded more than they were willing to give. Skirmishes broke out, and the tension between Columbus's men and the indigenous peoples escalated. Columbus, who had always sought to maintain peace, found himself in a position he had never wanted, to confront the reality that his presence, his mission, was causing harm. The journey, which had begun with so much promise, now seemed doomed. The passage to Asia remained elusive, and the dangers of the new world threatened to overwhelm them. And then, the final blow came. Stranded on the coast of Jamaica, with their ships damaged beyond repair, Columbus and his men found themselves cut off from the world. They were alone, isolated on an island far from home, with little hope of rescue. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Columbus, who had once been the great explorer, the admiral of the ocean sea, now found himself at the mercy of forces he could not control. His body, weakened by years of hardship, began to fail him. He was plagued by illness, his strength fading, but his mind remained sharp, focused on the dream that had driven him for so long. For over a year, Columbus and his men waited, their hopes dwindling with each passing day. They survived on the goodwill of the local people who provided them with food and shelter, but the dream of finding the passage to Asia, it was slipping away. The reality of their situation was harsh, and the hope that had once fueled their journey was now a distant memory. But Columbus never gave up. Even as he lay weakened by illness, he held on to the belief that his mission was not in vain, that the discoveries he had made, the lands he had seen, were of immense value. He knew that he had changed the world, even if he had not found the passage he sought. He wrote letters, documenting his experiences, pleading for rescue, but also reflecting on the significance of what he had done. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, rescue came. A ship, sent by the Spanish crown, arrived to bring Columbus and his men back to Spain. The journey home was long and arduous, but Columbus was at peace. He knew that he had given everything to his quest, that he had pushed the boundaries of the known world and opened the door to a new era of exploration and discovery. When Columbus returned to Spain, he was no longer the celebrated hero of his earlier voyages. The years of hardship had taken their toll, and the world had moved on. But Columbus's legacy, it was undeniable. He had shown that the world was larger, more diverse, and more interconnected than anyone had imagined. The Americas, though not the Asia he had sought, were a new world full of possibilities, a world that would forever change the course of history. Columbus spent his final years in quiet reflection, his body frail, but his mind still filled with the dreams that had driven him across the ocean so many times. He died in 1506, still believing that he had found a new route to Asia, never fully realizing the true magnitude of his discoveries. The final voyage had been one of immense challenges, of trials that tested Columbus to his very core. But it was also a journey of great significance, a journey that, despite its failures, revealed a world far greater than Columbus could have ever imagined. The dream of finding a direct route to Asia was never realized. But Columbus had opened the door to something far more extraordinary, a new world rich with potential that would reshape the future of humanity. Columbus's legacy is complex, a mixture of triumph and tragedy, of ambition and consequence. But it is a legacy that continues to echo through the centuries, a reminder of the power of exploration, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the enduring impact of one man's relentless pursuit of a dream. Chapter 10. The End of the Journey. The wind whispered through the sails as Columbus's ship made its final approach to the shores of Spain. But the cheers and celebrations that had once greeted his return were absent this time. The man who had once been the hero of the Spanish court, the man who had dared to sail across an uncharted ocean, was now a shadow of his former self. Tired, sick, and broken by years of hardship, Christopher Columbus returned not to glory, but to silence. His body, once strong and full of energy, was now frail and worn. His skin, weathered by the sun and salt of countless voyages, was pale and thin. The man who had once commanded fleets and discovered new lands now found it difficult to even walk without assistance. He had spent nearly his entire life at sea, exploring the unknown, but the years had taken their toll. As he stepped off the ship and onto Spanish soil, Columbus knew that the world had changed. And so had he. The dream that had driven him for so long, the dream of finding a new route to Asia, still flickered in his heart, but it was now overshadowed by the reality of what he had endured. The ocean that had once been his ally now seemed a distant memory, its vastness a reminder of the challenges he had faced. Columbus was no longer the celebrated explorer who had opened the door to the new world. Instead, he was a man who had been humbled by the weight of his own ambitions, a man who had seen the limits of human endurance. He returned to a world that had moved on without him, to a court that was no longer interested in his discoveries. The glory that had once surrounded him was now faded, replaced by the harsh reality of a life spent in pursuit of a dream that had never fully materialized. In his final years, Columbus withdrew from the public eye. He spent his days in quiet reflection, writing letters to the king and queen, trying to secure his legacy. His once bright future had dimmed, and he found himself struggling to reconcile the man he had become with the man he had once been. The letters he wrote were filled with a sense of urgency, a desperate plea to be remembered for the achievements he had brought to Spain, not for the failures that had followed. But the world was not so kind. Columbus's discoveries had indeed changed history, but the consequences of those discoveries were complex and far-reaching. The lands he had found were not the rich cities of Asia he had sought, but a new world altogether, a world that would bring both great opportunities and great suffering. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had greeted Columbus with curiosity and kindness, were now facing the harsh realities of colonization, their lives forever altered by the arrival of the Europeans. Columbus, in his final days, still believed that he had found a new route to Asia. He never knew that the lands he had discovered were continents unto themselves, vast and rich with cultures and civilizations that had existed long before his arrival. He never knew the full impact of his voyages, never understood that he had opened the door to an entirely new chapter in human history, one that would change the world in ways he could never have imagined. On May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus passed away. The man who had once dreamed of conquering the seas, of discovering new worlds, died in relative obscurity, surrounded only by his closest family. The great explorer, the admiral of the ocean sea, was gone, but his legacy would live on. Columbus's death marked the end of an era, the end of a journey that had begun with a dream and ended with the discovery of a new world. His life had been filled with triumphs and tragedies, with moments of great achievement and moments of deep despair. He had pushed the boundaries of the known world, had dared to venture where no man had gone before, and in doing so had forever changed the course of history. But Columbus's story is not just one of exploration and discovery. It is also a story of ambition, of the relentless pursuit of a dream, and of the consequences that come with such pursuit. His voyages had opened the door to the Americas, had brought together continents and cultures in a way that had never been done before, but they had also brought about the suffering of countless indigenous peoples, the beginning of a period of conquest and colonization that would shape the world for centuries to come. In the years after his death, Columbus's legacy would be debated and re-examined, his name both celebrated and criticized. Some would see him as a hero, a visionary who had dared to dream big and who had changed the world through his explorations. Others would see him as a symbol of the darker side of human ambition, a man whose actions had set in motion a series of events that would lead to the exploitation and suffering of entire civilizations. But regardless of how he is remembered, one thing is certain. Christopher Columbus's impact on world history is undeniable. He had shown that the world was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined, had connected continents that had been separated for millennia, and had paved the way for the modern era of exploration and globalization. As Columbus lay on his deathbed, his thoughts must have been filled with the memories of his voyages, of the lands he had seen, and of the people he had met. He had sailed across the ocean, had faced storms and shipwrecks, had discovered new lands, and had changed the course of history. But at what cost? The end of Columbus's journey was not the triumphant return he had once imagined, but it was a fitting conclusion to a life spent in pursuit of a dream. He had reached the limits of his world, had pushed beyond them, and in doing so had opened the door to a new one. And so, as the world moved on, as new explorers set out to follow in his footsteps, Columbus's name would be remembered, not just for the man he was, but for the journey he undertook. a journey that had forever changed the course of human history. The dream that had driven him, the dream of finding new worlds, had indeed come true. But it was a dream that had brought with it both great possibilities and great challenges. Christopher Columbus, the man, the explorer, the dreamer. His journey had come to an end, but his legacy would live on, echoing through the centuries, a reminder of the power of exploration, the consequences of ambition, and the enduring impact of one man's vision. Chapter 11. The Legacy of Columbus. The world was never the same after Columbus. His voyages across the Atlantic did not just chart new lands, they reshaped the very fabric of history. When Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492, he could never have imagined the monumental changes that would follow in the wake of his discoveries. The door he opened to the Americas, it was a gateway to a new era, an era of exploration, conquest, and exchange that would forever alter the course of human civilization. But the legacy of Columbus is not a simple one. It is a story filled with both triumph and tragedy, with moments of great achievement and deep sorrow. The age of exploration that he helped to ignite brought incredible wealth and new opportunities to Europe. New goods, new ideas, new cultures flowed across the oceans, connecting continents that had been separated for millennia. Europe's cities grew richer, its markets bustling with the treasures of the New World, gold, silver, spices, and exotic foods that dazzled the senses. Yet this legacy is also shadowed by the darker consequences of those voyages. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the arrival of Columbus marked the beginning of a period of intense suffering. The lands that had been their homes for generations were claimed by the newcomers, their ways of life disrupted, their cultures undermined. Diseases brought by the Europeans spread rapidly, decimating populations that had no immunity to these foreign illnesses. Entire civilizations, like the Taino, who had once greeted Columbus with open arms, were nearly wiped out. The exchange between the Old World and the New, often called the Columbian Exchange, brought with it a mingling of cultures, but it was not always a fair or equal exchange. For the native peoples, it meant the loss of their lands, their freedom, and in many cases, their lives. The wealth that flowed into Europe was built on the backs of the indigenous populations, who were often forced into labor or subjected to harsh treatment by the colonizers. Columbus himself, how should he be remembered? As a hero or a villain, a visionary or a conqueror? The truth lies somewhere in between. He was a man of his time, driven by the dreams and ambitions that defined the era in which he lived. Columbus was undoubtedly brave, a man who dared to venture into the unknown when others feared the edge of the world. He was a skilled navigator, an explorer who opened up new horizons, who pushed the boundaries of what was known, and who connected two worlds that had been apart for thousands of years. But Columbus was also a man who, in his pursuit of glory and wealth, made choices that had devastating impacts on the people he encountered. His treatment of the indigenous populations, driven by the quest for gold and the desire to please his patrons, was often harsh and unjust. The encomienda system that he helped establish allowed for the exploitation of native labor, and his expeditions set the stage for the waves of colonization that followed, which would lead to the oppression and displacement of millions. The legacy of Columbus, then, is a complex and contested one. On one hand, he is celebrated for his daring and his achievements, for the courage it took to sail into the unknown and to chart a course that others would follow. His name is remembered in history books, in the names of cities, and in the stories told about the age of exploration. Columbus Day is still celebrated in many parts of the world, a testament to the enduring impact of his voyages. But on the other hand, his legacy is also a reminder of the consequences of unchecked ambition, of the cost of conquest and colonization. For many, especially the descendants of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Columbus's name is associated with the beginning of centuries of suffering and loss. It is a name that symbolizes not just discovery, but also destruction. As we look back on the life and legacy of Christopher Columbus, we are confronted with a story that is not easily told in black and white. It is a story filled with shades of grey, with moments of great achievement and deep regret. Columbus was a man who dared to dream big, but his dreams came at a cost. The world he helped to create was one of connection and exchange, but also one of conflict and inequality. The legacy of Columbus forces us to grapple with the dual nature of history, to recognize that progress often comes with a price, and that the actions of one person can have far-reaching consequences. Consequences that ripple through time, affecting generations to come. In the end, Columbus's story is not just about the man himself. It is about the world he helped to shape, a world that was forever changed by his voyages. It is a story of exploration, of the human desire to reach beyond the horizon, to discover what lies beyond the known. But it is also a story of the consequences of that exploration, of the ways in which the pursuit of wealth and power can lead to the suffering of others. As we remember Columbus today, we do so with a deeper understanding of the complexities of his legacy. We recognize his contributions to the world we live in, but we also acknowledge the costs of those contributions. We honor his bravery, but we also reflect on the impact his actions had on the people and lands he encountered. Columbus's legacy is a reminder of the power of human ambition, of the ways in which our dreams can shape the world. But it is also a cautionary tale, a reminder that with great power comes great responsibility, and that the choices we make can have consequences that reach far beyond our own time. And so the story of Christopher Columbus lives on, a story of dreams and discoveries, of triumphs and tragedies, a story that continues to resonate through the ages. It is a story that challenges us to look at history with both admiration and critical reflection, to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be, a world where the lessons of the past guide us toward a future that is more just, more equitable, and more understanding of the complexities of our shared human journey. Chapter 12. The World After Columbus. The world, it was forever changed after Columbus set sail across the Atlantic. His voyages, once seen as the brave adventures of a visionary explorer, have become much more than that. They have become a symbol of both discovery and destruction, of human ambition and its unintended consequences. Today, Christopher Columbus is remembered not just as a man who opened new horizons, but as a figure whose actions set in motion events that would reshape entire continents and the lives of millions. When Columbus first set foot on the shores of what he believed to be the outskirts of Asia, he could not have imagined the far-reaching impact his journey would have. The Americas, a vast, rich and diverse world that had existed in isolation for millennia, was suddenly thrust into the global stage. This was a momentous event, one that would bring the old world and the new world into contact, a contact that would lead to the exchange of ideas, goods, cultures, and, tragically, diseases. The Columbian Exchange, as it would later be known, was a profound moment in history, an exchange that brought tomatoes, potatoes, and corn to Europe, and horses, cattle, and wheat to the Americas. But it also brought smallpox, measles, and other deadly diseases to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had no immunity to these foreign illnesses. The consequences were devastating. Entire communities were wiped out, and the population of the Americas was decimated. Columbus's voyages marked the beginning of an era of exploration, but also of colonization. The lands that he and those who followed him discovered were not empty. They were home to thriving civilizations with their own histories, cultures, and ways of life. Yet in the eyes of the Europeans, these lands were seen as new territories to be claimed, as sources of wealth to be exploited. The gold and silver that flowed from the Americas into Europe brought immense wealth to the Spanish crown, but it came at a terrible cost. The indigenous peoples were often forced into labor, their societies disrupted, their lands taken. The dream of exploration. It had become a reality, but it was a reality built on the suffering of others. Columbus himself, how would he have viewed this legacy? The man who dreamed of finding a new route to Asia, who believed so strongly in his mission, could never have foreseen the full consequences of his actions. He was a product of his time, driven by the same desires and ambitions that fueled the age of exploration. But today, we see his story with the benefit of hindsight. And with that comes a deeper understanding of the complexities of his legacy. Today, Columbus is both celebrated and criticized. For some, he is a hero, a daring explorer who crossed uncharted waters and changed the world forever. His name is synonymous with discovery, with the courage to venture into the unknown. Columbus Day, still celebrated in many parts of the world, is a testament to the lasting impact of his voyages. But for others, Columbus represents a darker side of history. He is seen as the harbinger of conquest, colonization, and the suffering of indigenous peoples. The arrival of Columbus marked the beginning of a period of exploitation, of the erasure of cultures, and the displacement of entire populations. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to rethink how we remember Columbus, to recognize the pain and loss that accompanied his discoveries. As we look back on the world after Columbus, we see a story that is both inspiring and troubling. A story that challenges us to think critically about the past and its impact on the present. Columbus's voyages were a turning point in history, but they also remind us that exploration and discovery are not without consequences. The world after Columbus was one of great change. Europe became richer, its cities bustling with new goods and ideas. The Americas, meanwhile, were forever altered by the arrival of Europeans. The landscapes were transformed, the populations diminished, and the cultures forever changed. The story of Columbus is not just about one man's journey. It is about the beginning of a new era, one that would shape the world we live in today. In many ways, Columbus is a symbol of the power of dreams, of the desire to explore and to know what lies beyond the horizon. But he is also a reminder of the importance of understanding the impact our actions can have on others. The world is interconnected, and what we do in one part of it can have ripple effects that spread far and wide. The story of Columbus encourages us to be curious, to seek out new knowledge, and to push the boundaries of what is possible. But it also urges us to be mindful of the consequences of our actions. The world after Columbus is a world that has been shaped by both the wonders of discovery and the tragedies of exploitation. It is a world that challenges us to learn from the past, to recognize the mistakes that were made, and to strive for a future that is more just and equitable. As we reflect on Columbus's life and legacy, we are reminded that history is complex, that it is filled with stories of greatness and of suffering, of dreams realized and dreams shattered. Columbus's journeys were the start of something new, something that would forever change the course of human history. But with that change came responsibility, a responsibility to remember, to understand, and to ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. The world after Columbus is a world of connections, a world where different cultures and peoples have come together in ways that were unimaginable before his voyages. But it is also a world where we must reckon with the consequences of those connections, where we must face the realities of colonization and its lasting impacts. And so, the legacy of Columbus lives on, a legacy that is both celebrated and questioned, a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the world and our place in it. As we move forward, we carry with us the knowledge that exploration and discovery are powerful forces, forces that can bring both great opportunity and great responsibility. The story of Columbus is a story of human ambition, of the desire to know and to explore, but it is also a story that reminds us of the importance of empathy, of understanding the impact of our actions on others, and of striving to create a world that is better for all. In the end, Columbus's legacy is not just about the past. It is about how we choose to shape the future. and how we can learn from history to build a world that honors the dreams and the dignity of all people.